Good morning, everyone. My name is Zhuzhu. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Wollongong School of Social Work. So I also acknowledge my supervisors, Michael Jones, Leslie Cooper, and Lynn Kivers, helped me shaping my presentation today. I'd like to start the presentation by acknowledging the traditional owner of the land, Whadjuk Noongar peoples I'm presenting today. Also acknowledge the Yoin Nation and the Darua country where my research activities conducted. So today, this is how my presentation is scheduled, starting from the background and talk about the research questions, methodology, and the research designs. Lastly, I'll present my preliminary findings for my PhD studies. Of course, this is the progress. The project still on progress. I'm very keen on any feedback from you guys. All right, so volunteers in disasters. Volunteers are very important human resources in disaster response and recoveries. Studies indicate that volunteers' contributions to disaster response and recoveries already being recorded in England, in the US, in Mexico, in Sudan, in Australia, etc. I can't list all their contributions here. So in Australia, in the Australian context, volunteers play a variety of roles in times of disasters. For example, they engage directly in firefighting and fire rescue, disaster rescues. They provide in helping transportation, catering, and communications. So one of the examples in Brisbane, over 50,000 volunteers were involved in mud cleanup activities following the flood in 2010 and 2011. We call them Mud Army. And in New South Wales, an example is volunteers help the community members fill over 60,000 sandbags to prevent property damage from the flood. So all the examples recorded demonstrated that contributions of volunteers from providing instant and essential assistance after natural disasters to enable a faster recoveries. However, there are less research investigated the volunteers' experience and their contributions in long-term disaster recoveries in Australia. All right, a little bit context about my research. 2019 and 20 Black Summer bushfire devastatingly impacted many communities across Australia. In New South Wales, there are more than 11,400 bushfires and grass fires across New South Wales. 26 lives was lost, and more than 2,000 homes were destroyed. More than 5.5 million hectares of land were burnt. Communities, farmers, local business, wildlife, and the bushland were heavily impacted. So my research looking at a group of volunteers in the little towns located in Queensland, which we call the Broadacre valleys in south coast down to the New South Wales, which is a very small population, around 800 people living there. If you drive from the University of Wollongong, it's going to take you around 4 hours. So this is where most of the data collected. I'll give you a little bit more information about what happens on the New Year Eve and the bushfire.
Do you mind if I just interrupt you for a minute? Sure. It's recording wrong screen.
Oh, yeah.
So if I just make sure it's recording the right thing. I'm sorry about this.
Oh, that's okay.
Share. Okay. It's paused. Okay. I think we've got it now.
Okay, so I can keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay. So on the New Year Eve of 2020, all the local residents were evacuated. The thick smoke came from the three sides of the valleys. And on the New Year Eve, the blade came from the three directions and swept through the valleys. So the pictures on the screen shows the town after the fires almost 1/3 of the town was swept by the fires, and 2 left lost during the fire because they stayed home, defended the house. The whole communities were in mourning through their shared loss and shock. Sad. So who are BlazeAid? BlazeAid is a voluntary organizations. They are volunteer-based organizations established after the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires almost 10 years ago. So the founders, 2 of the founders are farmers themselves. After the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires, their fence in the large farmland were totally destroyed. So the need to secure the 1,500 sheep was urgent. So they were very depressed at the first time because this would take them more than 1 month or even longer to rebuild the fence. But the 2 farmers called for some friends to help. So it's a magic. Their large farmland, the fence on their large farmland was built within 1 week, which would usually take them more than 1 month to finish. So that's a starting point from the BlazeAid. The 2 farmers starting register the voluntary organizations. They aim to help more farmers that are impacted by the bushfires. So unlike other mainstream organizations, there's no office for BlazeAid. They didn't employ any employees until the 2001 because the organization grows bigger and bigger. Everything's done by volunteers. For example, setting up the base camp in the rural communities, coordinating all the fence jobs. We have volunteer coordinators. They manage other volunteers as well as volunteer themselves doing cooking for the whole camp. They're doing cleaning. Mostly important, they rebuild the fence with the community. So the Cobargo BlazeAid camp is the longest serving camp in the organizations. They established the camp in the early phase of disaster recoveries in early January of 2020. And they finished all the 310 jobs registered on the system until the December of 2021. So that's 2 years period time. So they are on the record, there are more than 700 volunteers helped in the Cobargo camp. They are, but not only limited to, they are grey nomads. They traveling around Australia. They stop on 1 camp and doing a bit of volunteers. They are backpackers. We know lockdown. That's not easy for the international backpackers. BlazeAid is a really good place to accommodate all the homelessness backpackers. Give them working. They sign for the 88 days to extend the holiday working visas. Also, we have our local community members helping in the organizations. Of course, lots of them are retirees. So during the 2 years period time, they cleared more than 250 kilometers fences, installed more than 300 kilometers new fences. So it's equivalent to more than 3.8 million paid fence job. So the BlazeAid Cobargo camp has a huge economic input into the local communities. However, there's lack of understanding about the volunteers' contributions to the community's social and emotional well-being. So my research questions in this presentation is, what are volunteers' contribution to the community's social and emotional well-being in disaster recovery? So before we go through the methodologies, a little bit photos I took on the field. This is a little advertising they put in town to recruit more volunteers. They always need volunteers. So all volunteers are appreciated, no matter you are a good fencer or someone like me have no ideas about how to build a fence. How long do you want to stay? You want to stay there for 2 years or just contribute your 2 weekends? That's okay. Everyone is valued. So this is the show ground. That's where volunteers stays. Most of them will bring their caravan, or if they don't have a caravan, they have a tent. They can camp on the show ground. So this picture is their dining tables. Volunteers will have their gathering here. They eat food here, have a little bit of social activities here. So I don't know whether anyone have experience to rebuild fence. Probably you think that's not very hard, right? You put the poles on the ground and run some barbed wires. But if you look at the picture here, so the geographical conditions in Cobargo is quite difficult to rebuild a fence. and you have to carry all the materials by yourself going up and down to the hills. So that's not easy, especially for the people, they have knees issues. But the volunteer did all the job register on the system within 2 years. That's amazing. So holding the constructivism paradigms, I'm used to the constructivist grounded theories. If you are interested in more, we can talk about the latest. So what I did during the February 2021 to June 2022, I did a few times field trips. I interviewed 33 participants, including the 22 volunteers, 7 local farmers, and 4 local community members. So the face-to-face semi-structured interviews, and also I've done some Zoom and phone interviews due to the lockdown restrictions. I have observations when I had a field work, notes and reflective journals after each interviews were taken. Other resources also use, for example, a public Facebook page. They run a public Facebook page named BlazeAid Cobargo, so everyone can access to the information. So Envivo is the software I use to analyze data. All right, so I'm gonna elaborate some preliminary findings from my analysis. So before we keep going, I'll tell a little bit story about the pictures on the screen. So this is a picture I took in town. So remember I mentioned during the fires, the 1/3 of the town was swept by the fires. This is the first, it's just before the destroyed properties. Some people put the little craft on it, bring some vibrance to the communities. I think that's a sign of a recovery. All right, good. I'm gonna start and talk about the 3 relationships that the volunteers contributed to the local communities. Starting from the first one, the sense of the communities. So volunteers, they think the BlazeAid volunteer, they think they are part of the communities because they were being cared by the communities. They receiving the verbal and the written gratitude. For example, when they're walking on the street, someone will patting on their shoulder said, you did a good job, man. They get praised. They're receiving thanks card. People will post their gratitude via the Facebook page. So volunteers think they are part of the communities. So being part of the local communities compelled volunteers to committed to helping the community more and more. I need to go quick. And then they shop locally. They help the local business. We all know the local business is had a very hardship after the bushfire and the local communities. So the community members also invited the volunteers go to some community event, for example, Anzac Days March, some trivia nights running in the park. So the interactions created a sense of communities. That's also based on the building fences. So this is some quotes from the community members. I'm not gonna read this because I got a limited time, but the local community members and farmers think building fence is a way to show the generosity and the kindness from the volunteers. And the local community members feel being uplifted, say the fence has been built in the communities. So the next relationship is a respect. So BlazeAid volunteers share the powers while rebuilding the fence. They do not take control over all the fence building process. They always ask the farmers what styles of fence and materials they would like. So this ensures farmers' voice can be heard. So this also helps the farmers gain a sense of control. So in return, the local farmers show their respect, drop some food, drinks, supplies to the camps. The picture shows some local community members drop some eggs and they put a thanks card in this. Not only the local communities, the surrounding communities, the broad communities from the Bamagui, Telba, Narumas, all collaborate together, carrying the camp. This is a way to show the respect. So the last relationship I'm gonna talk about is the trust. So the building fence is a process to create a safe space for farmers to share their loss and griefs. Some stories from volunteers, they talk about sometimes they don't do the fence. They just sit down there. Farmer will talk, will share the loss and the grief from the bushfires. So that's important. And some volunteers commented, "We are not connected to the town. I'm not going to spread humors about the particular farmers, who has a really bad time. It is not our interest, not our business to do that. We were there and allowed them to talk. It is a very humbling experience, and you both treasure and protect it." All right, so this is a very beautiful story. Probably you can take a couple of seconds to read it. So this person in his 80s, after the bushfire, lost all the fences, was being so distressed and withdrawn in their daily lives. After the BlazeAid volunteers come for help, after witnessing some people in their similar age, even in their 80s, help them rebuild the fence, the person gradually come out of the house and doing the work together. And now the persons can looking after his farms. So from the comments here, so we know some positive change has been brought from the volunteers to the communities. All right, draw conclusions. So I will be talking about the 3K relationship. That's the volunteer contribute to the communities, a sense of communities, respect, and a trust. All right, last 1 minute. All right. Okay. So previous literature has highlighted the importance of the sense of physical place in disaster recoveries. Similar in my research studies, building fence is very important things after the bushfires. This study will add understanding of volunteers' contributions to local communities, social and emotional well-being. Lessons for disaster recoveries. One more thing I want to talk about. I think disaster recovery is not only the responsibility for the third sectors or for the non-for-profit organizations. It's a responsibility from the government, from the federal government, state government, local government, from the communities, from the neighborhood, from you and me. Thank you. That's my presentation.
And we'll keep the questions to the end. And our second speaker, Mary O'Halloran.
That one, this one, yeah. Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Mary O'Halloran. I'm a PhD candidate at Curtin University. So my research for my PhD, which this paper is from, is looking at the reliance on volunteers for the suppression of fire in Broadacre agricultural regions in Western Australia and the effects that rural change is having on their sustainability. I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So my aims for this paper were to examine the operations of volunteer firefighting in the context of continuing rural change. And these are all centred around the work of my PhD and creating a greater level of awareness around them. I felt this was particularly important for those who haven't lived in a rural setting, as I've found that people aren't aware of these less formal groups. So as I said, I skipped forward. So examining the operations of the volunteer firefighters in context of rural change. So from personal experience, an examination of the literature and other desktop sources painted a picture of change in rural Australia, and I'll discuss that more later in the presentation. So I wanted to know more about how these volunteers were operating in a non-static environment and how they were adjusting to these changes. So the second aim was creating an understanding around resourcing of volunteer fire brigades. The groups that I'm looking into are administered by local government authorities. So they're relatively autonomous from DFIS, and I wanted to understand more about how their resourcing was organised and what the understanding of it was in the community. I felt this was important because the projections around bushfires and climate change suggest that there'll be an increase in the number and scale of incidents that these groups are expected to respond to, and it needs to be ascertained whether they have adequate and appropriate resources available to them. My third aim was to determine the attitudes of volunteer firefighters towards their own sustainability and the factors that influence this. I wanted to create a better understanding of how those people on the ground perceive their own sustainability, what factors they feel influence their level of sustainability, and how they interact with these factors. So the methods I've used for this are qualitative. I did semi-structured interviews, 26 overall, 11 in Kojonup, 8 from Wongan Hills and 7 from Hyden. I'll go into my case study locations in a couple of slides. The interviews were sourced. I come from Kojonup, and I know a lot of people in rural areas, so my first port of call for getting interviewees was personal sources. My second one was using shire resources, so that each shire will have, the local government authority will have a bushfire emergency contacts booklet. So I then went through that, and I also used snowballing from my initial interviews to see if they knew of anyone else who would be interested in it. My interviews in Kojonup were conducted in 2019, and these were all done face-to-face in various locations. In regards to Wongan Hills and Hyden, this was after the pandemic had hit, so obviously I was operating under the limits of not only the government mandates, but people's comfort with my face-to-face proximity. So I undertook these interviews over the phone. I didn't use video conferencing software for a couple of reasons. One is the connectivity issues that rural people have, particularly in areas such as Wongan Hill and Hyden. These are quite remote. And also because of the mobile job of a farmer, which the members of these groups predominantly are, they're not often sat at a desk, they're often on different parts of their land. So that was the most convenient way to get the information from them. So interviews were recorded, transcribed, and then thematically coded through in vivo. So just a little bit of context about fire in Australia, and I'm sure you're all familiar broadly. So fire is an intrinsic part of life in Australia, and that's for a few reasons. It's climate, it's vegetation, and it's topography. Voices in the literature have constructed Australia as the most fire-prone country in the world, and an average of 54,000 fire events happen each year. This, of course, varies. And as we saw from the previous presentation, you'll have years where this is a lot higher. So fire can be incredibly useful. It's used for land management purposes. This has been done by traditional landowners, Indigenous people, and that's being looked at a lot more recently, and how that can be incorporated in more contemporary land management. It's also used a lot in farming, initially for land clearing, and in modern agriculture for stubble burning of previously cropped lands. But it is the most deadly of the natural hazards that affects Australia, and 250 people have been killed between 1966 and 1999. Because of the scale of Western Australia, volunteer bushfire brigades shoulder a really heavy responsibility for mitigating the effect that fires have on communities. And they're the only frontline defence for rural communities against fire in these sorts of events. So across Australia, there are around 220,000 volunteer firefighters, and in Western Australia alone, there are about 25,000 volunteers operating in about 750 brigades across the country. So the structure of volunteer fire brigades varies across states and territories, but in Western Australia, there are sort of two broad sectors. You have those overseen by the Department of Fire and Emergency Services, who often work collaboratively with Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attraction. And then you get those groups that are overseen by local government authorities. And these are the group that I'm looking at. And they're predominantly made up of farmers and other landholders and stakeholders. So a lot less is known about these groups. And from speaking to them, they often actually don't see themselves as volunteers. They see it as part of their livelihood. So even very small communities find it important to have a volunteer fire brigade. And this is because speed is a really important element in ensuring that the size and damage inflicted by a fire is minimised. So it's really important to have fire suppression capability in close proximity. Because these groups are a really entrenched part of Australian communities, they've been taken for granted for a long time, and there's questions being raised about the level of support given by government. And this is becoming more apparent as volunteer firefighters are becoming more scarce in communities. And there's been sustained decline across Australia in the number of volunteer firefighters. And it's raising concerns about the continued viability of some of these groups. The dangers of disbanding is you're leaving a community both unprotected and reliant on neighbouring communities, who then, if they send all their resources to you in case of fire, leave themselves unprotected. So this is going to become more problematic as rural change continues to alter the population dynamics of these areas. So just a bit about rural change. So rural areas have been constructed in the literature as sites that have been experiencing almost nothing but change, demographic, social, economic and technological. And this intensified in the late 1960s, where neoliberalism really came to the fore, and a complex collection of global, national and local factors challenged the way that agriculture was being undertaken. So this forced people to adapt to economies of scales, and you got to that idea of farmers either getting big or getting out. So this had quite damaging effects, not only on the farmers but their communities, because smaller farmers and their families had to decide between accumulating or leaving. They often would leave the farm, and then they would often leave their communities because of the lack of employment in the area. So this had a damaging effect and caused a cycle of decline as people moved elsewhere for opportunities, and particularly younger people moving out of the area. So this led to the continued withdrawal of services and further damage to communities. And it's really put the sustainability of fire brigades at risk, as it struggles for members, and those that do remain are getting a lot older. So my case study locations, I decided to centre my PhD around quite different towns to try and see if the factors affecting the brigades were different or similar. So you've got Cobargo, which is in the Great Southern region, that bottom one there. So Cobargo is in the Great Southern region. It's got a population of just over 1,900 people. It's about 264 kilometres from Perth. Wongan Hills, which is the top one, is part of the Wongan-Ballajoo LGA. It's in the central Midlands sub-region of the Wheat Belt, a population of nearly 1,300, and is 174 kilometres northeast of Perth. And Hyden, which is the furthest east, is in the eastern portion of the Cundinnan Shire. It's got a population of 384, and it's in the Wheat Belt South sub-region, 332 kilometres from Perth, and that hits up against the rabbit-proof fence. So the southwest area of Western Australia is really important, both economically, biodiversely, and also it's got a lot of Indigenous history in the area. So one of the themes that came up repeatedly in my interviews was the idea of personal expense that was being taken on by the farmers in their operation. So as the threat of fire is intensifying, individuals in their farming operations are taking on significant financial burdens to ensure that they can protect their land and their communities. Because the way farmers work and a lot of the regulations around it, farmers all have to have firefighting equipment anyway. So one participant said every farmer in the district basically has to have a firefighting unit. And the extent of this reliance on farmers was outlined by another participant who said, we'd be shot without investment of local farmers. When it came to the sort of equipment they were buying, it really varied. There were slip-on units, which are tanks that hold a few hundred litres. They can either be mounted on a ute or they can be on trailers. But it also went up to ex-Department of Fire and Emergency Services trucks that people were buying from their own money and fitting to suit their needs. That people were also investing in water tankers because water is such an issue, particularly in, don't have the map there anymore, particularly in Wongan Hills and Hyden. And I did this research when we'd had a really dry spell, so it was water was a big problem. So you're looking at a significant investment, and one participant noted that people were spending up to $100,000 on some of their firefighting units. People are now buying multiple firefighting vehicles. That allows them to preference either speed or water, and it also adds to the firefighting capacity they're able to contribute, allowing other family members and employees to go to fire as well. Personal expenditure didn't stop at equipment. People, because of the connectivity issues in the bush, people were fitting their houses, their sheds and their vehicles with mobile phone boosters, which cost about $1,000 each, to ensure that they were able to communicate on the fire ground. Farmers felt that they had a responsibility to provide high quality firefighting equipment because they had a responsibility over their land. And there was the idea that people should contribute firefighting resources commensurate with the size of their land. But not everyone was ascribing to this, and there were farmers noting that other people should really up their game in terms of what they were providing. So as well as expenditure, people were highlighting income loss by through attending fires and through fulfilling leadership positions. And in one of the towns, a couple of people mentioned a local contractor who was in a leadership position and had lost $30,000 in contracts simply from going to fires in 1 year. Another farmer from a different location, when I asked how much time they'd contributed to fires over the 1 year, they said they'd lost the equivalent of one person's salary because it had been a really bad fire year, and when there's a fire, you just drop everything and go. Despite this possibility for income loss, there was no resentment or anything. People knew that it was simply a matter of there's a fire and you drop everything and go. Another common theme around equipment was the way in which improvements in equipment were making up for losses of population, and people were using that to mitigate the loss of capacity within the brigades. So the narrative around expenditure, I'm waiting for the number to come up, 5 minutes, oh crikey, focused on the necessity of maintaining an effective firefighting force because it could affect their neighbourhoods and communities. So then I moved on to the idea of sustainability, and this was a really mixed theme. People were predominantly positive about it, but that was because they felt that there was no other option in their area other than them to fight fires. So while some people were positive, they were still worried about the sustainability of their brigades because of the dwindling numbers. The overall sentiment that while there were problems that were going to be faced in continuing to function, they would, because there simply wasn't another option. Volunteer loss was a consistent theme, with people noting that in their general local government's area, the number of the people on the land was falling, and therefore there were less people to attend fires. So amalgamation is a very big thing in a lot of these areas, with people having thousands and thousands of acres. And when a neighbour sells, usually someone in the area will buy it. So you still have the same area of land, but you have less people responsible for it. And so this is a real reflection of changes in the farming model and the migration patterns across different life stages. So in one local government area, one of the brigade leaders commented that they used to be able to rely on about 200 units turning up to a fire. This was now down to about 150 units, and this was across about a decade. And this has led to a sense of anxiety around the continued operability of local fire brigades. Another element was the adoption of quite advanced technology within farming itself, and this meant that they no longer needed to employ as many people, thus there were less people on the ground to help. And one farmer succinctly put it that the people are being replaced with bigger machines, and unfortunately the bigger machines come in, they don't come with a fire truck. Some people put forward quite a contrasting narrative, suggesting that numbers were being maintained by younger people coming back from university to work on the farm, but they still did acknowledge that amalgamations were having an effect on the number of people. An interesting pattern that was also emerging was the accumulation of land by corporate entities and the different cultures around fire brigades, and even the characteristics of the people they were employing, in that they weren't often local and they were often transitory. So the role of fire brigades and its continued sustainability was highlighted by a participant when I asked them about their particular brigade's sustainability, and they said, there's nothing else around, so we just have to keep going, and people like the local community will always volunteer for it. So moving forward, in terms of resources, as the fieldwork demonstrated, there was a strong reliance on firefighting equipment provided by private individuals and enterprises. While participants reiterated they didn't want to be paid for the work that they were doing, there was the sentiment that there was more that could be done by government to encourage the acquisition of advanced, often expensive firefighting appliances. So going forwards, government across the local, state and federal level have a role to play. One participant suggested a program that could be initiated was matching funds with a farmer to purchase firefighting equipment, and that would allow them to buy larger and more sophisticated equipment. And this particular participant said this seemed like a good idea to them because of the areas of land they're occupying. They're also paying the emergency services levy on their rates, which is the thing in WA. So they felt that if they were contributing in that way, there should be some return. In terms of sustainability, the increase in farm sizes and the entry and intensification of corporate entities into agricultural areas, it's important to ensure that relevant resources are available to these people on the front line in rural Australia. So the suggestions among participants were having fire equipment that was commensurate with your land size, and they reiterated that while the number of people may have declined, the firefighting equipment and its advancement was somewhat mitigating that. So to enable this to continue, the farmers pointed out the financial drag this was causing and that there needed to be some support. It was consistently stated that the need for fire suppression in rural areas meant that there would always be people who were willing to volunteer. This really demonstrates the strength of rural communities across space, and that they shouldn't be left just to support themselves. Going forward, interviews highlighted the need for more concerted government support and interaction, particularly if personnel, I'm on my last slide, if personnel deficiencies continued along their current trajectories. However, a really important part of the identity of these groups is their autonomy, and their rejection of what they see as needless bureaucracy. So any support measures would have to be approached in a really consultative manner to guard against alienation of a really important group of volunteers. I spoke to this particular volunteer who is in his 70s and has been volunteering for a long time, and he posed this situation where WA was basically on fire, places like Margaret River, really populated places, and he was pointing out that when that bad day arrives that we need help, help won't arrive. We'll have to depend on our own ability to protect ourselves. So with the effects of rural change altering the rural landscape and reducing the number of people available to volunteer, there really needs to be a focus on the measures to ensure that their sustainability is paramount. Thank you.
I'm assuming there are going to be a lot of questions, and we'll have a bit of time for that. John,
Yes.
you're up next. This is John Mason, who's doing a PhD as well.
I am. That's me.
Just do this. And view. Come on.
There we are. Penny, just so I'm clear, to advance, I just hit that.
Yeah. All the arrows.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. There we go.
Thank you very much. I'm right to start, Liz? Am I okay to start?
Yes, please,
Okay.
sorry.
That's all right. No,
Apologies. Yeah, asking questions.
no problem. Well, good morning. I'm John Mason. As Liz pointed out, I'm a PhD student. I want to send my respects to the traditional owners of this land I stand on, first off. And I want to say my paper that I'm going to present today summarises the interview-based research I've been doing for the past 4 years in rural Queensland. I work under the supervision of Professor James Southcott, who's with the Monash School of Education, Culture and Society. And today I'm going to discuss the research findings that relate to volunteer sustainability issues that dovetails nicely with what Mary's just talked about. Now, I crafted this presentation today to champion the voices of my research participants. So therefore, consequently, my explanation of methodology and method is going to be very brief. I'm here to talk about what my participants think. But I'm very happy to go into ontology and epistemology during the question time. More than happy. Queensland's 28,000 volunteer firefighters, excuse me, I'm just getting over the flu, are all members of rural fire brigades. They are neither government employees nor officers. So thus, from here on in, I'm going to call them members. So not really involved with government. You'll notice also during the verbatim quotes I'm going to provide for you that there's this acronym QFES. Can I do that?
Sorry about that.
So QFES. And that stands for Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. That's the overarching government body, umbrella body, that looks after the Rural Fire Service, or RFS, along with the State Emergency Services, or SES, which is nationwide, of course, and also Foreign Emergency Services, which is your red trucks, career firefighters. Now, first of all,
I'll let you find your
yeah,
page again. Sorry,
just-
I've just,
no, you're right.
thanks.
It's okay. Now, why did I start this research? Well, that's interesting because it sprang directly from my own lived experience. It wasn't something that I dreamed up to get a PhD. It's something that happened to me, and I thought this is a good reason for me to do some research. So the genesis of my research evolved directly from personal reflection on my own lived experience. Now, that lived experience happened within my volunteering life world, my personal life world, in the volunteering world. In January 2017, quite recently, I, along with 28 other new recruits, underwent a mandatory basic training, which is required before you become operational as a firefighter. I came from a volunteering background. My wife and I relocated to rural Queensland. We were living off grid. We were in a very bushfire-prone area. So we'd better join the local rural fire brigade and be ready to deal with fire. Now, I underwent the training. I went back to my brigade and immediately began attending call-outs with fellow brigade members. So I was initially mentored by more experienced members, and my brigade, in my case, my brigade provided ongoing support and encouragement as my skills and confidence increased in a gradual way. However, and this is the crunch, this is what got me thinking and got me involved with this research, is I also realised that that positive experience of brigade onboarding that I had was certainly not universal. My colleagues at training, we decided to exchange our contact details, and we stayed in touch. Every few weeks there'd be a phone call. How are you going? What are you finding in your brigade experience? And I quickly learnt that many people weren't happy. They were leaving. They were critical of what was going on within their brigade and leaving. Now, the end of that is that by 2017, late 2017, just before Christmas, 12 of the 28 had left in that basic training group that I attended. So that surprised me and perplexed me. How could so many enthusiastic people that were really driven to help their community throw their hands up and leave? I wanted to know why, what was going on. So regarding the issues that the research addresses, I reflect on a range of member sustainability issues. That was my core focus, is the sustainability of members. Why is member recruitment falling? As Mary, I think Zhuzhu also, I don't know whether I said that, I'm sorry, said that correctly. Why is member recruitment and attrition, member recruitment falling and attrition rising all over the nation? It's not just in Queensland, it's pretty much everywhere. Why do eager new recruits leave after just a few months? What is going on? Why so few female members? In the area I live, there's a lot of urban and international, I call urban or interstate migrants. With COVID, a lot of people, we'll go to Queensland. The land's cheap, great climate. A lot of international people are attracted there for similar reasons. So where are all the culturally and linguistically diverse people? I see them in the streets, but I do not see them on the fireground. Where are they? So I kind of sussed out in my own way that not joining or deciding to leave a brigade has to be fundamental in some way to this issue of declining member sustainability. It's got to be the fundamental thing. I'm not going to join or I'm going to leave, therefore numbers fall. Just makes common sense to me. So without any doubt, external factors impact that decision to not join or to leave. And they are the demands of family, the time constraints of paid employment, the ageing process, and so on. Nonetheless, it still came back to my mind that a significant number of my training colleagues had nominated, recruited, trained, onboarded, and then decided to leave. So it just seemed to me, plain common sense, that internal factors impacted sustainability, and I wanted to know what those factors are. As such, I decided that data useful in developing answers to the issues up there may reside within the meaning, the personal meanings that members form during their lived experience within their volunteering lifelong. Now, in terms of significance of my research, well, I have to say, from where I stand as a beginning researcher, the first and foremost reason it's significant is it provides a forum for members to tell their volunteering story. They're being listened to with this research and other research. They're not, rather than just counted and measured. Second, it addresses a pressing social issue. According to Queensland government stats, that's government stats themselves, there's been a 17% statewide reduction in member numbers over the past 4 years. And that's with the Black Summer thrown in the middle of that. So even then, people decided not to join. So much so there's been a lot of government interest in what's going on with the Rural Fire Service in Queensland. So late last year, Mark Ryan, who is the current Minister for Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, commissioned KPMG to conduct an independent review of this QFES, this Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, the umbrella organisation. And those review findings were publicly released just 3 weeks ago, 27th of October. So I won't talk about them in this presentation, but I will say that surprisingly, to me at least, despite 9 government reviews since 1992, there remains a paucity of peer-reviewed member sustainability research in the Queensland context. Instead, the Rural Fire Service, and indeed most of these government reviews, they tend to rely on statistical information that's developed from member surveys and from focus group sessions when training occurs and such. Now to my research questions, which are very, very straightforward, and you can see for yourself. There's nothing fancy there. It's just an attempt to work out what's going on. Now I'm interested as a phenomenologist. I'm very interested in the phenomena, and those under study that I'm particularly interested in are those phenomena that influence members' decisions to join, stay, or go. That's what my focus is. Now, exploring these phenomena, my research is concerned with the meanings formed by members within their own particular volunteer life work. So it's specific. There's no attempt to conduct empirical research here. It's a very small sample group in one small area of Queensland. It may be generalisable, but it's just what's going on around the area I live. Now, these 3 straightforward questions underpin my research design, my interpretive analyses, and my development of findings. It's all about that. Now, a very brief mention of my research methodology, and I won't spend much on it, as I've said, much time. And I'll find the right page here somewhere. We'll get there. Got it. So what what I did was, along with Jane's help, we developed an open life world phenomenological approach for the research. So just quickly, open. Open in the sense that I maintain openness as an ongoing struggle. I didn't see being open as a researcher as some sort of intrinsic trait inbuilt in some way. It was a battle. I continually fought, making something definite, which actually wasn't definite. It was indefinite. So I resisted that lure, and I remained closely involved with the phenomenon study, which was easy because I have insider status. I'm a volunteer myself, and I strive to keep the research open to all possibilities. Life world, well, the lived experience of participant members provided my primary data source. There were other sources, but that was the primary one. Understanding their volunteering life world was the principal focus of my effort. That's what I've been doing for the last few years, is trying to get my head around how other people experience their volunteering life world. So now, phenomenological, well, my research, as I've already mentioned, is concerned with the phenomena appearing in lived experience, and my attention was always directed to, well, those life world phenomena influencing the decision to join, stay or go. And lastly, an approach. Well, open life world research is an approach rather than a method. My research was exploratory and inductive, and there's no attempt to disprove or prove theory. So I commenced with that theory. Now to introduce my research participants. There they are. The participants responded to my invitation in a member news sheet, and that way they were able to contact me directly. My contact details were in that invitation, so they phoned me direct and we started to talk. You'll see there, without any QFES knowledge or involvement, I should add. So they were free to speak their mind. No one was looking over any shoulders. The participant age range you can see is 50 years there, which is quite normal in Queensland and other states. The face of rural firefighting in rural Queensland is my face. Mature age, Caucasian male, retired, semi-retired. And I think that's fairly general across the nation. I know in Queensland it's most certainly the case. Now, at the time of the interviews, the majority of participants were active firefighters, 16. The 7 that were recently active they'd left in the last 12 months. So what made them leave was fresh in their mind, and they could talk about it, and they did. They talked with great passion and some anger and despondency and frustration about why they made the decision to leave. 5 of the 6 women that I interviewed were active at the time, and participants were predominantly male. Now, findings. Let's get down to the real good stuff. There they are. That's just a summary of the principal findings relating to member sustainability. I'll address each topic in turn, each element that I put up there, but I'd just like you to keep in mind, please, that many of these topics overlap and co-depend on one another. They don't really stand like a silo. They're all mixed up. Okay, so I'm going to move on here. So exclusion, well, I've decided just to put up quotes of my participants and I'll talk to them because it's their voice that's important in this. Member exclusion events occur both within the Rural Fire Service as an organisation and within brigades. It's different, but still there, this exclusion. With regard to the Rural Fire Service, participant interaction with paid officers, paid staff at area, regional and state level often produce feelings of exclusion. 16 participants described their exclusion from the machinations of the Rural Fire Service, and the Rural Fire Service is often seen as a bastion protecting the interests of paid staff. That's my participants' view, not mine. That's what they're saying. Most participants voiced their feelings of exclusion from the organisational decisions that actually affected them. They weren't part of that decision making, and that upset them. Many participants felt powerless within their volunteering life work. Now, at brigade level, it was a bit different, as I said. Member exclusion events within brigade are often associated with gender bias issues and poor leadership. There seems to be a bit of a sort of an orbit between poor leadership and gender role playing. In some brigades, a preferred culture is actively maintained through the exclusion of members with new ideas and fresh perspectives, which feeds in a bit to what Mary said about the changing demographics, population demographics. We've got a lot of new people coming in, not a lot of people that have lived their lives there going out. So exclusion and lack of acceptance are principal elements in the development of an unwelcoming brigade culture. That is unwelcoming to the others. 4 female and 3 male participants experienced exclusion events at brigade level, and member exclusion tended to overlap with member non-acknowledgement, which I'll talk about now. Excuse me. Many participants experienced examples of non-acknowledgement. Both community and the Rural Fire Service are involved with that. Wasn't so much so at brigade, but certainly at community level. The continual Rural Fire Service failure to appropriately acknowledge and reward member contributions caused feelings of frustration, anger amongst some participants. They were pretty wild about that. With rural communities, the non-acknowledgement of members appears to be a widespread phenomenon. So it's not so important nowadays that your neighbour is a member of the Rural Fire Service. It's not a matter for respect or acknowledgement, sadly. So next is non-acknowledgement at community level. So local community attitudes profoundly affect member wellbeing and motivation. So there's that. I'll leave that there and just move on because I see I've got my timing mixed up. Sorry about that. I'll just move on to gender issues. Gender issues arose constantly when discussing workplace culture. It was a constant thing. And interestingly, female and male participants alike, they voiced a heroic notion of leadership where there's this sort of influence of power and gender existing in all the social interactions within the brigade. It was almost military. You know, like a military leader is the sort of leader we need in our brigade. I've got here, participants' perceptions regarding appropriate leadership were often quasi-military in nature. So how am I going for time?
We haven't got long, but another minute.
Another minute, okay. Well, I'll jump ahead. Sorry about that.
That's right. Very short.
I will, it'll be short. So what I'm going to talk about is what do members really want? That's the question, the paper's question, right at the title is that question. Well, I'll say this, nobody I talk to asked for a pay increase, so I've got that to be thankful for. So it's certainly not about money. The things they want, they don't want much, and it's actually quite intangible what they want. It's not about buying stuff. They want to feel valued at both brigade and organisational level. This will entail, in my view anyway, a fuller consideration and acknowledgement of their professional contributions. That's not happening at the moment. That's a big part of the problem, that community and the Rural Fire Service and more generally QFES don't acknowledge volunteers appropriately. They want to be accepted. This will entail creation of enlightened leadership and increased acceptance of contemporary social mores, especially about gender roles and leadership. They want increased self-efficacy and greater opportunities to pursue their volunteering aspirations. Most people that join the Rural Fire Service have got a vision of where they want to be. I know I certainly did and do. It's not just, I'm there to fight a fire. It's also to do something for myself, to improve myself. So they want the freedom to pursue personal goals within their volunteering life world. This will entail the development of perspectives and organisational structure to increase the agency of members and diminish various forms of bias. So I contend that pronounced structural and attitudinal change within the RFS and QFES to some extent is fundamental to achieving all these wants. A truly effective change process will also require enactment at brigade and community levels. So lastly, I'll say is it may be we need to reimagine the core structure of Queensland's Rural Fire Service and ask ourselves, is this service simply another volunteer involving organisation managed and led by paid career staff, or in reality, is the service a cohort of 28,000 capable and ambitious volunteer workers looking toward the Queensland Government for support, acknowledgement and inspiration? So that's something I think that really all of us in Queensland have got to think about. Thank you very much. That's it. I'm sorry I messed up the timing. As I do, I went off at tangents.
It's all right.
Anyway.
It's all right. It's very limited time.
Yeah, it
to
is.
be doing something that is obviously so complex.
Anyway, thank you for listening.
Well, we're going to ask you some questions when.
Oh.
No, not at the moment, but after Jack McDermott has given his paper.
It's been shared properly. Sorry about this. Just having a bit of problems with the way Teams is actually sharing. Okay.
Sorry, Jack.
One of those things. I don't know what I'm looking at here, so either leave it to you.
Yeah. Okay, we've got it. we go. Sorry about that.
Thank you. No worries. Hi, everyone. So I'm Jack McDermott. I am a policy officer and I'm on the National Strategy team at Volunteering Australia, leading our research program for the National Strategy for Volunteering, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. So this piece of research, which I'm very lucky to be currently working on with Professors Nicholas Biddle and Matthew Gray at the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods, sort of fits into two broader programs of research that we're working on at the moment at VA. One was on the impact of COVID on volunteering, which was a program that we started in 2020, and this is the most recent and hopefully last piece on that particular topic. And secondly, it fits into a broader piece of research that we're doing at the moment on volunteering in Australia in general. So looking at the state of volunteering now and trends going ahead. So in this presentation, I kind of wanted to discuss both of these broader pieces of research a bit, share some of our new insights on trends in volunteering in Australia, and then present this piece of ongoing research, which I've called The Paradoxes of Volunteering in the COVID Era, the experiences of current and former volunteers. So first, I just thought I'd talk a bit about what's going on with volunteering in Australia now. Where are we at the moment and where are we going? So Australia actually has a very long history of volunteering, and in many ways this is the sort of volunteering that happens here is distinctly Australian. Professor Melanie Oppenheimer, who's a leading historian on volunteering in Australia, has described in her work the Australian way of volunteering, which is shaped by our distinct but evolving relationship between government, society, civil society and volunteering, which has been touched on a lot at the papers of this presentation, which is awesome to see. Australia's unique geography and climate, our particular model of federalism, and also our diversity and multiculturalism. In more recent history, though, volunteering hasn't perhaps fared quite as well. Official data has been collected and published by the Australian Bureau of Statistics through the census since 2006 and General Social Survey since 2002, and that's the data that I've got displayed up here. And we can kind of see that the rate of volunteering overall is fairly sort of steady in the 2000s and sort of starts to decline from 2010 up to 2020, which is the most recent official data that we have from this source. So that's kind of where our research comes in. We started collecting data in collaboration with the ANU CSRM at the start of COVID to examine the impact of COVID on volunteering in Australia in general. Our most recent research was conducted this year in 2022 to inform the development of a new national strategy for volunteering. I'll talk about that as well. And we had two surveys that we conducted as part of this. So one is a survey of the general Australian adult population, which was done this April, and included a sample of about 3,500 people, of whom just over 1,000 were volunteers. We also conducted a survey of 1,345 volunteer involving organisations across Australia and every state and territory in May and June of this year. I will mainly be talking about the population survey, just because that's the data source that I've used for my paper today. But I'm also going to pull a bit from the organisation survey just to put some numbers behind some of the themes that sort of get pulled out in this research. And in an amazing sort of stroke of luck for us, or I suppose it's not luck, but the first wave of, so we've actually collected 5 of these surveys, or 4, sorry. I'll get to that in a second, between 2019 and 2022. So we actually have a pre-COVID observation period, which is super exciting for me when I started at VA to see that as a bit of a data nerd. So I'll talk a bit about the trends in volunteering as well. We collected a lot of data this year on volunteering. There were 25 questions included in the survey, but I'll just touch on the big numbers today. The biggest being the rate of volunteering in the adult population. And we sort of found what you'd expect, a significant decrease in the rate of volunteering in Australia from 36% in our 2019 observation period overall down to 24.2% in April 2021, so during COVID. So we saw a general decline over the past 10 years and then quite a sharp decrease during COVID. On the bright side, we do have a slight uptick in the data in April 2022, as you can see by this in this figure, up to 26.7% of the total population. However, this still equates to around 1.86 million fewer volunteers in Australia compared to pre-COVID. On the organisational side, the demand for volunteers remains quite high, as you'd expect. In a survey of volunteering involving organisations that we conducted this year, around 4 in 5, so 83%, reported that their organisations need more volunteers immediately or in the near future. Organisations also face other challenges, so COVID-19 remains a significant challenge, with 88% responding that COVID was one of their most significant. However, changes in volunteering styles, population changes and technological changes were also major drivers of change in organisations. So that kind of sets the scene a little bit for what we expect might become challenges in the space moving forward. Just to touch briefly on the data and methods. So we conducted this population survey on an online longitudinal panel survey called Life in Australia, which is done by the ANZTSR and included questions on volunteering in 2019, 2020, 2021, and most recently this year. As I mentioned, we collected quite a variety of data on volunteering, but for this paper, I'm specifically discussing 2 questions on the experience of volunteering. So we had a lot of data that showed us that fewer people are volunteering. That's fairly well established, but less on what it was like for people who continued. And that's mostly the focus of this paper. So I'll be discussing responses to these 2 questions. One's for volunteers. How has doing voluntary work during the last 12 months impacted your life in general? It's a very broad question. And then we also had a question for previous but not current volunteers, inviting them to describe their experience volunteering in the past as well. For the purpose of this paper, I used a more inductive approach. So I looked through all of the responses to these questions. There were almost 1,000 for the first and about 500 for the second, to pull out, allow things to kind of emerge as respondents provided them. So we will be planning to look through these responses again with a more content analysis lens, but for the purpose of this paper, we took a more exploratory approach. So what was the experience of volunteering like? In 2021, we asked this same question: how has volunteering over the past 12 months impacted your life in general? And we got 820 responses. The main findings from this were that people who reported volunteering at the same frequency or more often during COVID, so this was in 2021, were more likely to report positive experiences, and those who volunteered less more likely to report negative experiences. Positive experience were typically things like people talked about maintaining connections with others through volunteering, keeping active during the pandemic, experiencing a sense of purpose, or gaining new skills. However, a lot of people also indicated reduced satisfaction with volunteering, reporting a loss of connection and less sense of making a difference. There are also those who said that their experience was more overtly negative. They highlighted increased workloads, especially as demand for volunteer-provided services increased, and heightened concern over risks of volunteering, especially when their role was undertaken in person. A lot of volunteers were providing essential services during the pandemic. We also found that there were some types of volunteering, so from this data, environmental volunteering and any remote roles like board and committee work were relatively unaffected, which is a plus. So how does this compare to the experience of volunteering this year? And I've rather riskily used the term post-COVID, but we'll take that with a grain of salt, I think. So we found a lot of the same results, actually. Most people were fairly positive about their experiences. So the positive responses represent the largest category, and the most common were that people reported their volunteering created a sense of community or provided opportunities for social contact. A lot of people also responded that they found it fulfilling to help other people through their volunteering, and that volunteering gave them a sense of purpose. And I've included a few quotes from respondents up there on those. These themes are also fairly well aligned with the most common motivations to volunteer. So in our survey, we asked respondents who indicated that they volunteered what were their reasons for volunteering. Just over 7 in 10 selected personal satisfaction or to do something worthwhile. 6 in 10 selected to help others in the community. And other common reasons were social contacts, to use skills and experience, and to be active, which is fairly common in these surveys of volunteer motivations. Probably the most striking new code, which I picked up when I was looking at this data, is about time. Compared to the 2021 data, a much greater number of people discussed the challenges of managing time volunteering. And these typically emphasized increases in caring, paid work, domestic labour, and other responsibilities with which their volunteering was understood to conflict. In last year's survey, this was discussed a bit, so time was a theme in a much smaller number of responses, but most people said that they had less time to volunteer or spent time during volunteering on different activities, such as implementing COVID-safe protocols. So this, where in the 2022 data, this was much more often volunteering was more often described as something which challenged volunteers' time management and could detract from other activities. This kind of tracks quite well with what we understand as reasons that people don't volunteer, and we included this question in the survey as well for non-volunteers. When people are asked why they don't volunteer, work and family commitments is by far the most common response. Interestingly, or though perhaps not surprisingly, women are more likely to provide this response than men, at 46.3% of women compared to 35.6% of men. Those aged 35 to 44 years were also more likely to cite work and family commitments, which sort of reflects the heavier family responsibilities and higher rates of paid employment in this age category as well. So it's quite interesting to see, this is sort of what we understand as reasons that non-volunteers don't volunteer, but it's interesting to see some of these pressures reflected in the experiences of current volunteers as well. The pressures of paid work responsibilities were also highlighted, and many respondents indicated that their time spent volunteering increased their overall workloads. They understood their volunteering as being more work-like in that context, or detracted from their ability to pursue paid responsibilities. And this is kind of reflected in the data that we collected as well. Financial barriers can often be a significant reason for not volunteering, especially for younger people and people living in capital cities. We also found that people who reported financial difficulties in their life in general were less likely to have recommenced volunteering since the start of COVID. That's the graph there. As a final sort of interesting point, a lot of people emphasised changes in the way that they were able to volunteer after COVID. So a lot of respondents indicated that the type of time commitment that they made was more difficult this year than it was the previous year. This is something we also hear from organisations, and I put that data on the screen as well. In a 2022 survey, most respondents indicated that the capacity of volunteers to commit their time was one of their more significant challenges among volunteer-involving organisations. And also, while a lot of organisations do provide episodic or smaller commitment type of volunteering opportunities, most respondents, so most volunteer-involving organisations who responded to our survey, and that's about 90%, indicated that they involve volunteers in ongoing roles performed regularly, which could be a challenge for engaging volunteers in the future if this model continues as a predominant model in Australia. I'll just talk quickly, out of concern for time, about some early findings from the experiences of former volunteers. So those who indicated that they had volunteered in the past, but not in the past 12 months, were asked to describe their experiences of volunteering previously. Of these, most respondents were positive about their volunteering, and they tended to indicate that it was rewarding, made them feel good to help others, or facilitated social interaction, similar to the responses of current volunteers. However, there were some very interesting negative responses which differed a bit. So respondents who said that they were negative about their experience of volunteering typically indicated that they disliked the tasks or were treated poorly in their roles, which is quite interesting, reflecting on the presentations we've heard earlier today as well. just to sort of conclude, and with to end on sort of a brighter note, we are currently developing the new national strategy for volunteering. This has been in development for the past 10 months of 2022 and is being co-designed now by the volunteering ecosystem. The research that I presented today was designed to inform the development of this strategy. So we're eager to consider the challenges that are identified in research and the challenges that other researchers here today have identified. The draft national strategy was released earlier this week, so we have a draft, very exciting. And we're currently seeking feedback from stakeholders across the ecosystem. So that includes volunteers, organisations, governments, philanthropists, peak bodies, and researchers, very importantly. So this is